What's going on, everybody? This is Chet from Fight Breakdown. I saw this on Twitter, and it just got my mind thinking about the value of being undefeated and what that actually means as far as ranking fighters. I think that being undefeated is overrated, especially by casuals, novices to the sport. And I talk a lot about MMA, but of course my first love growing up is boxing. And so I read this tweet by ESPN Ringside that said if Tyson Fury retires, he will be the second heavyweight champion in the history to retire undefeated after Rocky Marciano. And so it has Fury's record 32-0 and 23 KOs, Marciano 49-0, 43 KOs. So innocent enough, right? But when you get into the comment section, the comparisons between all of the great fighters immediately come up because it's a sore spot. A lot of people that talk about boxing, Marciano's the greatest of all time because he was undefeated, and they'll leave it at that, right? Without any other criteria. All right, and that bothers me because I feel that people can't be that ignorant so they're just kind of trolling when they say stuff like that. And I feel like the same thing is going on with Tyson Fury. Like, Tyson Fury is definitely a good fighter, and a fighter cannot be blamed for being born in his particular era, right? You only can fight the fighters that are around in that particular era. So, is Tyson Fury a good fighter? Certainly. All right, but when you really try to compare him in different eras, are you really able to put him up there with the likes of like George Foreman, Ali, fighters, of that magnitude? And the same with Marciano. And of course, right, we can't make these fights. They're impossible to make. People live and die at different times, right? We can't have Tyson Fury versus Mike Tyson in his prime or something like that. Or Tyson Fury versus Muhammad Ali. But what we can do is we can look at least at their boxing records and ask ourselves basic questions, right? So we're not just blinded by they're undefeated, right? Because doesn't competition matter? If I were to ask you a question, who were Rocky Marciano's? This is for boxing fans out there, old school boxing fans. Let's say, who were Marciano's toughest opponents? Name me three guys, his toughest opponents that he fought, his best opponents, best opposition. You could type that in the comment box. I would say that most people would say Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, and Ezra Charles, right? Okay, that sounds good on paper because all three fighters are Hall of Fame legendary boxers. But here's the caveat. Jersey Joe Walcott was old as hell when he fought Marciano. He was 37 years old on paper. And I say on paper because back in those days, dudes could have been 50. And, he's 37 years old. He was old as hell on paper. They said he was 37. So, being an old black man back in those days, he probably was at least 41, 42 years old. But, for the record, he was 37. Which is, as we know, past the prime for a fighter. And he still almost defeated Marciano. And Marciano caught him with one of the most beautiful punches in history. Right? I'm not taking that away from him. But that has to be considered. You in your prime, you're in your 20s, right? 28, 29 years old. You're in the top peak condition of fighting a dude that's had, miles and miles and a lot of mileage put on him. 37 years old on paper, right? So that's one of his toughest fights, right? One of his best fighters that he fought. Let's go to Joe Louis. Joe Louis, again, Hall of Fame fighter. Some people say he's the greatest of all time, even greater than Muhammad Ali. When did he fight Marciano? He fought Marciano again. Joe Louis had been retired for 2 years. He came back for economic reasons. Right, the tax man was on his behind, so he had to step back in the ring, unfortunately, which is the case with a lot of fighters. So he comes back. Right, he's like 36, 37 years old again. 2 years out of the ring. He retired because he didn't have it anymore. He was done. He comes back because of financial reasons. He gets knocked out by prime Marciano. You want to count that as okay? He's fighting the best version of Joe Louis. He's fighting Joe Louis at 90 years old. And then the third fighter I mentioned, Ezra Charles, again, Hall of Fame fighter. Remember, this is the heavyweight division. Go look up Ezra Charles. What weight class is Ezra Charles in his prime? What weight class is Ezra Charles? Ezra Charles is like welterweight. That's like, for those of you who are not familiar, that's like, say, like Floyd Mayweather going up to heavyweight and fighting. Alright? Only few fighters have been able to do something like that in history. Roy Jones was able to go to heavyweight and steal a title from John Ruiz. But Roy Jones was, legendary athlete. But again, when we look at Marciano's record, you see a lot of fighters that never really amounted to anything. Now, some people say some of the, his fights were fixed and all that stuff. And listen, I don't know for sure, but I guess if you do your homework, you find out who was really like running boxing a lot at the time. It's definitely possible, right? So, to have this story of this one, Italian fighter who just happens to be undefeated. But it's interesting that he never fought any of the like real top contenders, during his time. He could have fought somebody like a Floyd Patterson or somebody like that. Floyd Patterson, in my opinion, would have beat him, but he could have fought a Floyd Patterson. Who else was around at the Eddie Machen, guys like that, Cleveland Williams. There was some bangers out there that he could have fought. Right? There's some bangers at the time that Marciano could have fought. But the record is everything. Alright, so here I went on Boxing Rec and I brought up Marciano's record, 49-0, 43 knockouts. Alright, impressive. And now, if we look at the fighters, I'm going to go right to the beginning of the career. Now, of course, any fighter at the beginning of his career, he's going to be brought up, in a, calm, safe manner. He's not going to be just thrown to the top fighter. So I don't expect any of these early fighters to be anybody of, of note unless they became someone, down the line. So I'm not, tearing down Marciano for fighting any of these guys, Lee Epperson, these guys that, never heard of or really became of anything. Alright? So, he started his career in 1947. Never heard of any of these guys. And that's fine. He's just starting out. We go to 1949. Johnny Prezzi, Artie Donato, Jimmy Evans, Jimmy Walls, Don Mogart. Never heard of these guys. Competition, is being, carefully, picked, I'm sure, at this point. Don Mogart, these records, 17-9, 12-7, 32-13. All right, Tommy DeGiorgio, 9-9. Ted Lowry, 64-49. Goodness gracious, that dude's a fighting guy. Again, he's only been fighting for 2 years, and they fought a lot more often too, back in the day. So you could see, like in 1949, he had like 10 fights. But he's coming up. Then here in 1950, he fights his really first kind of strong opponent, Roland Lastarza, 37-0. You can't knock that, and he gives Roland Lastarza his first loss here. So Marciano has gained a split decision here. So now when I see a guy like this is how I do my research. When I see a guy like, say for instance, Roland Lastarza, now I see his record is impressive, but then I have to look, okay, who did that guy fight? Because I never really heard of him doing anything before or after. So when you're talking about the great fighters, great champions at the time, nobody's saying, oh yeah, Roland Lastarza was, you know, he was right up there, but he just never became champion. So you have to pretty much say to yourself that he probably didn't fight, you know, top opponents. You know, so he ended his career 57-9, 27 knockouts. And when you look at his record, and this is when he fought, that's the second time he fought Marciano. And you go back, and he was 37-0. And you guys could take the time and look and all of that stuff like that. But when he fought Marciano in 1950, Marciano was 25-0 at the time. And you can see the guys that he fought that become 37-0. Cesar Brian, Walter Hafer, Joe Dominic. So these guys are dudes that, like, you know, Don Moga, he fought some of the same guys that Marciano was fighting. You know, these are like lower level, Class B, Class C fighters. And that's how he built up his record. So that's why I say record is in everything. And even after he lost to Marciano right here in 1950, he went on, he still fought. Again, he didn't fight anybody of note or anybody that became anything. He wound up fighting Marciano again, and he never really fought anybody of note. So even though Roland Lastarza was 37-0 and it looks impressive, okay, I can't say, oh, this is a great fighter that Marciano fought. But at the time, Marciano being young in his career, we could consider that as a step up. So he beats that guy, but the next fight he fights is this dude Eldridge Eastman, 22-20. And this guy doesn't even have a picture. Alright, and then he fights a couple of more people, kind of like no name, 22-11, 30-18, 67-57. Like, who are these dudes? You know, again, these are Class B fighters, Class C fighters. So he fights nothing but, and I'm not using the word bums. Like, you know, that's Ali's word, bum of the month club and all that stuff like that. I'm not using that, or Foreman. But what I am saying is these fighters aren't, all the way up till he fought Joe Louis, you can't say that he fought a great fighter of anybody of note. Even this guy right here, right? Rex Lanes is 34-1. Okay. That's impressive. So let's see what's up with Rex Lane. Who did Rex Lane fight? Again, you could look yourself. Who did he build his record off of? And you can see here, Rex Lane actually lost to Ezra Charles right here. Ezra Charles at the time had 89 fights. And that's what I was saying about Ezra Charles moving up in weight. Right, Ezra Charles had been fighting for 100 years at the time. Let's look at Ezra Charles real quick. Right, his career was from 1940 to 1959, so 19 years in the game. A Cincinnati Cobra, right, fantastic fighter. My father told me that he was the best fighter that he ever saw. All right, but again, if you go back, Ezra Charles starts fighting in 1942. And look at the weight he's at. He's fighting at 161 pounds. You see what I'm saying? So gradually through his career, he moved up in weight. And by the time he fights Marciano, he's 20 pounds, 25 pounds above his natural, his prime weight, so to speak. Think of when Roy Jones again moved up the heavyweight, or James Toney, right? Remember James Lights Out Toney at middleweight, again moving up to heavyweight, all the way up to heavyweight and fighting Holyfield. I remember when he beat Evander Holyfield. Again, that's Holyfield way out of his prime. You think James Toney defeats Evander Holyfield in his prime, like in the 1990s at heavyweight? Of course not. So you always have to think of these things when you're looking at these fighters, and don't get caught up into the hype of, oh, they're undefeated, or they only have one loss, or they have a lot of knockouts. You have to look at other factors. Who did they fight? Who did they build their record off of? All right. So up until Marciano fights Joe Louis in 1951, he really, I mean, to be honest, right? You have to be honest if you're a boxing fan out there. I don't care if you're a Marciano fan or not. You have to be honest. He really hasn't fought any great, like somebody would say, oh, this is a great fighter right here. And when I say great fighter, let's take Sugar Ray Leonard for instance. We can, if I say names 3 great fighters Sugar Ray Leonard fought, right off the top of your head, you could say Marvin Hagler, Tommy Hearns, Roberto Duran, like right off the top of your head. And then from there, you can name like other fighters that like were really good too, or great also. Wilfred Benitez. I mean, I could think of a lot of fighters he fought that would be considered great fighters. Hector Camacho. You see, it's easy. Boom. And then the thing about it is Sugar Ray Leonard fought Tommy Hearns in his prime. They were both in their prime and they fought. There's no question, no argument. He didn't fight Tommy Hearns when he was 45 years old, or 37 years old, and Sugar Ray was 20. He fought Hagler. Hagler was 30. Maybe he was a little past his prime, but Sugar Ray Leonard was also a little past his prime. So they were still around the same age. It wasn't like Sugar Ray Leonard was 25 and Hagler was 34 or 35. You have to consider that. So when he fights Joe Louis here, yeah, Joe Louis has an impressive record. Oh my God, 66-2 at this point. Right, Joe Louis is 66-2. Right, the Brown Bomber. However, his debut in boxing was 1934. Come on, man, stop playing. Right? They were still playing on the piano back then. You know, people were like Lindy hopping and dancing real fast and twirling the girls up in the air and all that stuff. You know, they weren't even letting black piano players use the white keys back then. It was so racist in some areas. They're like, no, you can't play the white piano keys. Stop it! You know, there's a lot of struggle going on. 1934 is a debut. So we go through 1934, and forgive me if you already know this information, but it has to be put out there for posterity, because I'm trying to dead these Marciano arguments. And it's like we need truth to prevail. So here we go. So he gets the heavyweight title in 1942. I'm sorry, 1941. Let's go back. Actually, he had it before that. What's the first title shot? I don't want to waste too much time here. Was it 39? I think 1939. Yeah. He gets the title, because I know he had the title for like 10 years. And I believe he retired as heavyweight champion, if I remember. Yes, he beats Jersey Joe Walcott. Yes. He beats Jersey Joe Walcott in 48. And then he retires. See? 48, and then he retires for like 2 years. And he comes back, and that's when he gets his first loss to Ezra Charles. And he came back, of course, for financial reasons with the taxes and stuff like that. And then he fights some lesser fighters, Cesar Brian, you know, tune-up guys, Freddie Bashaw, or Emilio Agramonte. These dudes, like, he would have knocked out in his prime. Right, he fights this guy again, Cesar Brian. All decisions. He knocks out this one guy, Lee Savold, who obviously had been fighting a long time. 104 wins, 44 losses. Goodness gracious. Right? So he fights Rocky Marciano at this time. And again, Joe Louis way past his prime. Not only in age, but also just wear and tear. Right? The guy's been fighting since 1934. So only people that are desperate to build Marciano up and put him on a pedestal would really even respect that win and prop that up. That's like saying Larry Holmes beat Muhammad Ali or Trevor Berbick beat Muhammad Ali. Yeah, he beat Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali was 103 years old when he beat him. You know, that's not Muhammad Ali anymore. That's just the shell of Muhammad Ali that's left. Right? That's just like when Tyson was getting knocked out in the late 1990s by Class C fighters. You think that's Tyson? You think that's the Tyson that people? Oh yeah, that's the Tyson that we're talking about? No, we're talking about the best years, the prime years. So he's not beating Joe Louis in his prime. Okay, so he knocks out Joe Louis, and again, then he goes back to these dudes: Lee Savold, Gino Bonvino, never heard of Bernie Reynolds, Henry Matthews, old school dude, 81-3. But again, do I have to go look at the fights and show you that Henry Matthews really didn't fight anybody either? These are like circuit fighters. Okay, not saying they're not good fighters, but you can't put them on that next level. In other words, Jersey Joe Walcott here, who's 49-18, is better than Henry Matthews, 81-3 all day. Right? Jersey Joe's a Hall of Fame fighter. He was just old by the time they fought. Plus, back in those days, a lot of times black fighters, due to racism at the time, they wouldn't get title shots until they were like damn near 40 years old. So it would be like, they would be fighting each other. The top black fighters would be fighting each other over and over. You know, like 4 or 5 times. You know, like you have like Ike Williams versus Bojack fighting 5 times a year. Because they want to give those guys a title shot. So eventually Jersey Joe gets the title shot, but he's old. Right? And he gets knocked out. And then he comes back and he gets knocked out the second time. Not saying it's not a good good win or anything like that. But again, dudes were like, quite old. Again, look at the debut. That's what I say. It's suspicious that he was allegedly 37 years old at the time. His debut is before Joe Louis' debut. His first fight is in 1930. Goodness gracious. The depression didn't even fully start yet. It was like just starting. You know, this was before the run on the banks were made. It's 1930. Just think about that. 1930, and he finally gets a title shot 22 years later. So, and he loses in a classic fight. Just the fact that he was able to put up a classic fight like that, incredible. So Ezra Charles gets a rematch, he loses, and then right after that, Marciano goes back to fighting these like Don Cockell again. Do we need to look at the record? Here's another great fighter I forgot to mention too, Archie Moore, another Hall of Famer. Another dude that was like 50 years old. The old Mongols. Look at his record when they fought. This is all you need to see. Can you do some quick math? Right. That's like 167 fights. 166 fights. when they fought. So obviously Archie Moore's not 26 years old. If he has 166 fights, just think about that. If he was fighting 10 times a year, just think how many fights. Let's look at Archie Moore, just so you can be believers. The old Mongoose, that's his nickname, right? The old Mongoose. Look at his debut, 1935. Hall of Fame fighter. But of course, by the time he fights Marciano, like you know what I mean, he's not the same fighter anymore. He debuted in 1935. His prime was probably like 1940. 1942. Maybe his prime was from like 1940 or 1935 to 1945. Let's give him 10 years. That's a long time, but let's say his prime was from let's say he debuted in 1930. His prime was from 1935. Taking 5 years to really hit his stride. So let's say from 35 to 45. By the time he gets to Marciano, he's out his prime. And he also fought Muhammad Ali in 1962. God damn. Damn, he was out of his prime by then. And of course, he got knocked out by Ali. You think this is a fight that people bring up to prove that Ali was the greatest? Like, oh, he knocked out Archie Moore. He knocked out Archie Moore when Archie Moore was 104 years old. It does not count. It just shows how great Archie Moore was. The fact that way past his prime, he was still able to beat these lesser fighters. Look at all the wins he has before Ali. Right? These are all like Class B fighters, Class C fighters that you never will hear about. But he was able to get these wins. Look at all that green on the side. That's showing all the wins. Right? He only lost to the top fighter. He only lost to champion. Look, Floyd Patterson, champion. And there's Rocky Marciano, champion. This is like 10 years past his prime, the old Mongoose. But again, when he was he debuted in 1935, so let's say his prime was from 1940 to 1945 or 1950. So if we want to make it 10 years. So again, back in the day, these fighters couldn't get title shots. So they hung around, and of course as times were changing, even though they were past their prime, there was more prize money being given out, so they will use their experience and their ring generalship and guile to be able to win these fights. But of course, they're not gonna breed a young, strapping guy in shape, that's able to take a punch, has stamina for days, and just can keep coming. And Marciano hit really hard. I'm just saying, to say that somebody is the greatest, you have to consider more than the undefeated record. Now let's look at Tyson Fury real quick. Alright. Tyson Fury, undefeated. That's great. 32-0-0. Let's see who he beat. Well, we know he just beat this dude, Dylan White. Again, who is Dylan White? Is he a top fighter? Like, you gonna put, where you gonna place him? He already had 2 losses before that. He lost to Povetkin. And then the rest of the dudes that he beat, you really haven't heard about. Here's Chisora. I think this is the dude that knocked out Joshua. Again, where would you put the opposition? He beat Chisora again at some point. Again, where would you put these fighters in the all-time? And most of these fighters are in England. Where would you put these boxers? His competition is in terms of the all-time scheme of things. You will say they were Class B fighters, Class C fighters, right? Maybe not even contenders. The fighter that maybe you would consider as maybe a fighter like Povetkin. All right, you say, okay, he's a step up, but he lost. He got knocked out by Povetkin. Then he came back and knocked Povetkin out. So that takes a couple of notches off, stripes off Povetkin. And then he went and got knocked out by Tyson Fury. So that a great opponent? And again, I would ask you the same question: Who were Tyson Fury's greatest opponents, best opponents? If you say Deontay Wilder, again, he beat Deontay Wilder twice. And listen, and a draw in the third fight. Again, is Deontay Wilder an all-time great in your opinion? All boxing fans know that he's a great puncher, but he's not a classic boxer. He's not a boxer. He's just somebody that's athletic and that can hit super, super hard. Now, I wish Deontay Wilder would have had a trainer like an Emmanuel Stewart or somebody like that back in the day, or Eddie Futch. You know what I mean? The Georgie Benton or somebody like that, and he could have took that athleticism and talent and really, and then combined with the power, man, you would have had something crazy. But a guy like Deontay is able to thrive in today's boxing environment because you don't have all of the heavyweights you had even back in the 90s. Back in the 90s, you had your Riddick Bowles. You remember him? You had Riddick Bowe. You know, you had your Lennox Lewis's. You had the Klitschko brothers, right? You know, at the top. And then you had lesser guys, right? That were really good. Like David Tua. Dudes like that. Very dangerous fighter. David Tua knock your head off. Very dangerous fighter. See, you had to be more than one dimension back then to be a champion. You couldn't just come in like, yeah, I got a lot of power. Listen, David Tua would be champion today with these dudes. He would knock these dudes' heads off, and that would be that. But back then, you needed more skills. You know? Yeah, like dudes like Hasim Rahman back in the day. You know? The dude that goes, let's go, champ. Let's go, champ. Dudes like that. Probably be champion today. That's what I'm saying. The level, the overall level of fighter is lesser right now. And I think what it is that other sports have opened up and fighters are going into if you're athletic and you have a choice, you're gonna go into more like lucrative sports if you can. You know, maybe do other, you know, maybe play baseball, basketball, or something like that if you can, or even try MMA, even though there's more money in boxing. Right? But back in the day, boxing was really like the only outlet, you know, for combat sports to get a lot of money. So people went into boxing. So the level of competition is not as steep as it was right now. So dudes that, this is my opinion, dudes that are winning now and being champions and, you know, looking impressive now wouldn't have looked so impressive with if they were mixed up in you know, in those other time periods. But again, like I say, if I ask you who are the top challenges for you know, top fighters for Tyson Fury that he fought, his stiffest competition, I mean, it's hard, you know. Okay, there's Vladimir Klitschko, right, 2015. Again, we can say that again, Vladimir past his prime at this point. Remember, look at Vladimir Klitschko's debut, 96. Come on, man. 1996. He's a Hall of Fame fighter, but 1996. So his best years, you probably could say, I don't know, from 2000 to 2007, 2008. Let's give it like an 8-year run. Then after that, okay, you know, he's not in his prime anymore. And he fights Fury in 2015, so it's kind of, you know, he still went to a unanimous decision at the end. Again, not taking away from Fury, like he can't control the time period that he was born in. But like I said, when we start making these arguments all-time great, you know, you got to look at the fighters they fought. You can't just look at the records. You got to look at the fighters they fought. Like, for instance, I see here Deontay Wilder 40-0. Impressive. But again, I asked you the same thing. Who did Deontay Wilder fight of note? Right? He lost twice to Tyson. Then you got Louis Ortiz. Louis Ortiz almost beat him. But how old is Louis Ortiz? Again, he's another dude with a shady age put on paper. They say he's like 38 or something, but the dude's probably like 49 or something like that. Like, who are these dudes? Dominic Brazil, Bermain Stiverne. Again, There's no shame in losing. But the way you tell if a fighter is really good is what does he do before and what does he do after the win or the loss. These dudes, you never heard of anything, of them doing anything. So yes, he was 40-0, but it's like, all right. The only way it's gonna be impressive is by looking at the competition, and you could do the same thing with Iron Mike Tyson. I know everybody loves Tyson because of the power, but again, ask yourself the same thing: who are the top fighters that he fought? I would go and tell you that the top fighters that he fought, he lost to. Whether it's Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, right? He always lost to the top fighters, except I would say the best fighters that he fought, whether win, loss, or age, the best fighters that Mike Tyson fought, Lennox Lewis, Holyfield, Larry Holmes, and Michael Spinks. Okay? Now, of course, he fought Larry Holmes again in the same scenario like Marciano Joe Louis. Larry Holmes, way past his prime, coming off 2 years retirement. He was like 37 years old. He beats him. Nevertheless, Hall of Fame fighter or whatever. But still, Larry Holmes past his prime. Michael Spinks, Hall of Fame fighter, but as a light heavyweight, not Hall of Fame heavyweight. Light heavyweight coming up. And he was able to dance around when he fought Larry Holmes, Michael Spinks I'm talking about, because Larry Holmes didn't have the movement at this point in his career. So he could. So Michael Spinks was able to bounce around and pot shot him and then win on points. Plus, they didn't want Larry Holmes to break Marciano's record at the time too. So there was some politics in those fights. Nevertheless, Tyson moved just as fast as a middleweight, so Spinks couldn't do anything with him. But if you want to say who are Tyson's greatest fighters that he fought, those would be it. The champions he fought weren't that great. Bone Crusher Smith, is that he going down as a great champion? What about Trevor Berbick? Great champion? No. And then if you look at the dudes Tyson fought before that, he didn't fight like great fighters, but he fought some good opposition. You know, Carl the Truth Williams was pretty good. Trevor Berbick was good. Pinkley Thomas was good. Like these weren't great fighters, but they were good. Again, he can't control who he fought at the time, but he did what he dominated, and that's what put Tyson, you know, some steps above. He didn't just go to decisions with these dudes. He dominated. He dominated and cast fear over the entire division, right? But of course, losing a guy like Buster Douglas, that definitely take some demerits away from him, right? Then going to prison, all that, coming back and never really reaching those heights again. So yes, Tyson was definitely a phenom and all that stuff like that, but definitely unfulfilled potential. In closing, I just want to look at one more thing and drive this point home. Alright, finally. This is why many, including myself, consider Muhammad Ali the greatest heavyweight of all time. Notice he is not undefeated. He's 56 wins, 37 knockouts, and 5 defeats. And been stopped once. That was at the end of his career against Larry Holmes, I believe, because he retired. He didn't go out on his back. But you would do the same analysis with Muhammad Ali. Like, okay, who did he fight? This and that. And of course, his first bouts are going to be against, like unknown fighters and things like that, which is natural. So you can't even count, these early fights. All right. So then by 62, he starts stepping up in competition. There's old school Archie Moore, as I told you, who was like about 105 years old at the time. But, a crafty veteran fighter. Ali did what he had to do. And they keep going. Then you had Doug Jones, good heavyweight fighter at the time. You see Ali stepping up. Henry Cooper. That's a fighter where he was, he still Cassius Clay. He was knocked down in the 4th round. And he finally comes back and stops Cooper. Then he fights Sonny Liston. We already know Sonny Liston, Hall of Fame fighter. Sonny Liston was like a Tyson, like a Foreman type dude back in the day. Right, he wasn't playing. He knocked out the heavyweights of his day and took the title. Sonny Liston destroyed Floyd Patterson, another champion. You see, when you have a champion defeating another champion, that gives that fighter, props, over somebody that just defeat, like, say, like a regular fighter. Again, like, how many champions did Marciano defeat? Former champions. Or people that went on and became champion. See, Sonny Liston knocked out Floyd Patterson, who was the champion. He took the title from him, and then he knocked him out again. You see, so that shows me Sonny Liston is legit. Because he beat another Hall of Fame fighter. And you have Ali defeating Sonny Liston twice. Then defeating Floyd Patterson by TKO. George Chuvalo, another great fighter. Right, then Henry Cooper again, decent fighter. It's more like tune-up type dudes. Brian London, Carl Mildenberger. Again, good record, but again, good German fighter, but not, Then you had Cleveland Big Cat Williams. Again, good top heavyweight contender at the time. Ernie Terrell. So you can see these dudes are dudes you could look up. Like, I'm not going to, make the video super long and look up everybody, but if you look up who these guys fought, they all fought good fighters who guys would be top contenders and things like that. Right? In other words, Ali wasn't fighting chumps. Zora Foley, again, good fighter. Jerry Quarry, good fighter. Alright? And this is after 3 years layoff. This what makes Ali great also. He was laid off for 3 years because of everything that happened with the protests and the war and everything. Still came back and didn't fall off. So now he's fighting the next generation of fighters. Because before 67 he's fighting his generation, like his peers. When he comes back, he's fighting a new breed, new generation, and beating them guys too. Oscar Bonavena, again, good fighter. He goes up against world champion at the time, Joe Frazier in 71, 26-0. We all know Joe Frazier's a Hall of Famer. Do I need to click on it? We all know that he's a Hall of Famer. But he loses to Joe Frazier 15 rounds. No shame in that. Jimmy Ellis, good fighter. Buster Mathis, good fighter. Jurgen Blin. Okay, you had to look his record up. Like, he's a decent fighter or whatever. Mac Foster at the time, good fighter. As you can see, 28-1. But did I say great fighter? No, it's just good fighter. Good, solid competition. Ali fighting good dudes. A lot of these dudes would beat everybody on the list of Marciano that he fought. That's what I'm saying. George Chuvalo would beat all of those guys. Jerry Quarry would beat all of those guys. You got Alvin Lewis. Again, he fights former champion Patterson. Beats him. He knocks out Bob Foster, Hall of Fame fighter. But again, as I said with Michael Spinks, Bob Foster is a beefed up light heavyweight. Nevertheless, he wanted to come up and get that smoke from Ali. Ali knocked him out. But great fighter, Hall of Fame fighter. Joe Bugner, right, decent fighter. Ken Norton, again, another top level heavyweight. Then Ali lost to Ken Norton. Then he comes back and beats Ken Norton. Then he fights this dude, more like a tune-up type fight, Rudy Lubbers. Then he fights Joe Frazier again. Again, former champion. Defeats him. George Foreman, 40-0 in his prime, champion. We already know what happened there. Do I have to keep showing you how great the greatness of Ali? Then he fights Chuck Webner. Again, we talking about the next generation here. Ron Lyle. At this point, Ali's already past his prime. When he fought George Foreman the first time, Ali's past his prime. This is why Ali's so great. He's past his prime and he's still beating these dudes. He's now, instead of him being able to use his speed and dancing around the ring for the whole 15 rounds, he has to use experience, guile. He has to trick them. He has to get under their skin, get them mentally with words and calling them names and stuff like that, and calling them sucker and rhyming and stuff like that. He has to use gimmicks, and it's working. Ron Lau, again, good fighter. Beats him. Bugner beats him. Frazier, again, former champion. The next generation of fighters he's fighting. Jimmy Young, Richard Dunn, never heard of that guy. Again, Ken Norton, he beats him. Alfredo Angelista. Ernie Shavers, one of the hardest hitting punchers in history. Not the greatest boxer, but one of the hardest hitters in history. They say he's probably the hardest puncher in history. You know, either him or Foreman, but a lot of people say Ernie Shavers hit harder. Again, defeats him. Then he loses to the next generation. So this is, Leon Spinks represents like the fighters coming out, you know, it's 1978. This is the next generation. Leon Spinks is in his 20s. At this point, Ali's like 35, 36 at the time. Leon Spinks is in his 20s. Spinks beats him. Ali's so great, he comes back and defeats him in the rematch, 15 rounds. The next generation, right? And finally, in 1980, Father Time finally catches up with Ali. And it's a Hall of Fame fighter who happens to be Ali's former sparring partner, Larry Holmes, who would go on to be heavyweight champion for, I believe, 7 years. And he had a lot of title defenses. I can't remember right offhand. Larry Holmes had a lot of title defenses. And he actually retired undefeated also. He came back. And that's when he lost. He retired undefeated, and I believe he came back and fought Spinks. I know he lost at the end, and he was trying to break the record with Marciano's. Then he lost to Spinks, and he retired bitter, and he came back. But yes, finally Father Time catches up to Ali in 1980, and he loses his last 2 fights. Only time Ali was ever stopped is he retired in round 10. Right, never was on his back, counted out or knocked out, grabbing his mouthpiece like Tyson was against Buster Douglas. Even past his prime, Ali was never took like beat downs like that. You know, flat on his back. Like I'm thinking of Lennox Lewis Tyson right now, flat on his back. Buster Douglas Tyson. You know, even at 37, 38 years old, Ali still able, you know, to hang in there. Then he finally again retires after losing to Trevor Berbick, young Trevor Berbick, right? Again, man in his 20s by decision. So again, if that's not a convincing explanation, I don't know what is. Like I said, don't go by the hype with these dudes saying, oh, such and such is undefeated, therefore he's the greatest of all time. I probably can go on Boxing Rec and show you many undefeated fighters. That doesn't mean they're the greatest. You have to look at the opposition. You have to look at what these fighters became. You gotta look at what these fighters became before, what they were before, and what they became afterward. You know, did they go on to become a champion or whatever? For instance, Roy Jones, a perfect example. I don't want to keep making the video any longer. It's almost an hour. But let's take Roy Jones, for example. Roy Jones is an excellent Hall of Fame fighter, right? When he fought James Toney in his prime. James Toney was like 44-0 when they fought. He gave James Toney his first loss. He defeated Bernard Hopkins in his prime. Hall of Fame fighter. Now, after he fought Bernard Hopkins, did Bernard Hopkins and James Toney just fall off the radar and never heard from again? No, these fighters went on and won more titles in other weight classes, other divisions. In other words, they showed that they were great fighters. They just ran into somebody who's better at that time. So when a fighter goes on and still becomes great, even though they lost, that boosts the credibility and stature of the fighter that defeated them the first time. So that makes Roy Jones, that moves Roy Jones even higher, because it shows that he just didn't beat like some bum, right? He just didn't beat some, bum of the week fighter. That shows he beat like a bona fide Hall of Fame fighter. And that's what I'm saying. You got to look at the fighters, what they did beforehand and what did they do after they fought. And that's how you can tell. Right? We know Joe Frazier was good. We know George Foreman was good. Matter of fact, George Foreman won the belt 20 years after he fought Ali, right? Remember George Foreman knocked out Michael Moore? That shows you how great Ali is. Because Ali beat this man in 1974 when Ali was past his prime. Ali was like 34 or something like that. Found a way to use rope-a-dope and beat George Foreman. George Foreman then showed how great he was by getting up from that and retiring from boxing and all that stuff like that, and come back 20 years later and winning a heavyweight title. That's what greatness is. It's not just have undefeated record. I'll take that 56-5 any day over Tyson Fury's undefeated record or Marciano's undefeated record. That's my take on the situation. I'm out. Please support my channel. Get in those comment sections. I want to hear what you guys think. All right? And I'll see you guys on the next video.